When most people think of serial killers, names like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy immediately come to mind. These monsters have been analyzed, dissected, and turned into documentaries countless times. But lurking in the shadows of criminal history are killers whose names you've likely never heard, yet whose crimes are equally disturbing, if not more so. Today, we're diving into the dark world of 5 serial killers who somehow escaped widespread notoriety despite leaving trails of unimaginable horror in their wake. These aren't the killers who captured headlines or inspired Hollywood films. These are the forgotten monsters, the ones who operated in different countries, different eras, and often different circumstances than the killers we know so well. But their stories are no less chilling, their methods no less brutal, and their impact on the communities they terrorized no less devastating. What makes these cases particularly unsettling is how they reveal that evil doesn't discriminate by geography, culture, or time period. It exists everywhere, waiting to manifest in the most unexpected forms. Let's begin our journey into darkness with Christopher Worrell, a name that might sound familiar to some, but not for the reasons you'd expect. Born in 1947 in Adelaide, South Australia, Worrell became one half of what would later be known as the Truro murders, a series of killings that terrorized South Australia in the mid-1970s. What made Worrell particularly dangerous was his ability to appear completely normal, even charming, to those around him. He was described by friends and family as intelligent, well-spoken, and someone who could easily gain people's trust. Worrell's killing spree began in December 1976 when he partnered with James Miller, a younger man he had met and quickly dominated. Together, they would cruise the streets of Adelaide looking for young women, particularly those who appeared vulnerable or were hitchhiking. Worrell had a particular preference for targeting women between the ages of 15 and 26, often choosing victims who were either runaways or had troubled backgrounds, knowing they were less likely to be immediately missed. The duo's method was sickeningly systematic. Worrell would use his natural charisma to lure victims into their car, often offering rides or promising parties with drugs and alcohol. Once the women were in the vehicle, they would be driven to remote locations in the Adelaide Hills, specifically around the town of Truro. What happened next was a nightmare of sexual violence and murder that would haunt the families of the victims forever. Between December 1976 and February 1977, Worrell and Miller were responsible for the deaths of at least 7 young women. Their victims included Veronica Knight, just 18 years old when she disappeared on December 23, 1976, and Tanya Kenny, only 15, who vanished on New Year's Eve. The killers showed no mercy for age or circumstance, treating each victim with the same calculated cruelty. What made these murders particularly heinous was the torture that preceded death. Worrell derived pleasure not just from killing, but from the prolonged suffering of his victims. The women were subjected to hours of sexual assault and psychological torment before finally being murdered. Their bodies were then disposed of in shallow graves throughout the Adelaide Hills, treated like garbage rather than human beings who had families, dreams, and futures. The killing spree came to an abrupt end on February 19, 1977, when Worrell was killed in a high-speed car crash while fleeing police. He had been driving recklessly, as was his habit, when he lost control of his vehicle. His death likely saved more lives, as there was every indication that he and Miller would have continued their murderous rampage indefinitely. Miller was subsequently arrested and became the key to solving the murders, leading police to the burial sites and confessing to his role in the crimes. The impact of Worrell's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The Truro murders changed how South Australians viewed safety, particularly for young women. Parents became more protective, hitchhiking became taboo, and an entire generation grew up with the knowledge that monsters could look like anyone, sound like anyone, and be trusted by anyone until it was too late. What makes Christopher Worrell's case particularly disturbing is how easily he could have continued killing if not for that fatal car crash. Unlike many serial killers who eventually make mistakes that lead to their capture, Worrell was methodical, careful, and showed no signs of losing control. His death was purely accidental, a twist of fate that prevented what could have been dozens more murders. Now let's travel across the world and back in time to early 20th century Australia, where we encounter Martha Randelle, a woman whose name should be spoken alongside the most notorious female serial killers in history. Born Martha Morris in 1871, she became known as one of Australia's most sadistic child killers, targeting the most vulnerable victims imaginable, her own stepchildren. Randelle's story begins in 1906 when she moved in with Thomas Morris, a widower with 5 children ranging in age from 5 to 14. Morris had recently separated from his wife and was struggling to care for his children while working as a laborer. Martha appeared to be a godsend, a woman willing to help care for his children and provide stability to his chaotic household. But beneath her helpful exterior lurked a monster who would turn the Morris home into a house of horrors. Almost immediately after moving in, Martha began what can only be described as a systematic campaign of torture against the Morris children. Her method was as ingenious as it was horrific. She would tell the children and their father that they were suffering from diphtheria, a common and often fatal disease in that era. As their treatment, she would swab their throats with hydrochloric acid, commonly known as spirits of salts, claiming it would cure their ailment. The reality was far more sinister. The hydrochloric acid would burn and inflame the children's throats, making it impossible for them to eat or drink properly. They would slowly starve to death while appearing to die from a legitimate illness. This method allowed Martha to kill the children while maintaining the appearance of a caring stepmother desperately trying to save them from disease. The local doctors, lacking the forensic knowledge we have today, would often attribute the deaths to diphtheria without conducting thorough examinations. The first victim was 9-year-old Annie Morris, who died in agony on July 28, 1907. Her death was followed by that of 7-year-old Olive Morris and then 14-year-old Arthur Morris. Each death followed the same pattern, with Martha playing the role of devoted caregiver while secretly administering the poison that was killing them. What makes Martha Randelle's crimes particularly chilling is the premeditation involved. She had to purchase the hydrochloric acid, plan the timing of each treatment, and maintain her facade of concern while watching children suffer. Neighbors later reported hearing the children's screams during the treatments, sounds that Martha dismissed as normal reactions to the medicine. The level of psychological cruelty required to maintain this charade while torturing children to death, reveals a depth of evil that's difficult to comprehend. The truth began to emerge when George Morris, one of the surviving children, became suspicious of his stepmother's treatments and fled to his biological mother. His testimony to police about what he had witnessed in the Morris household led to an investigation that would eventually expose Martha's crimes. When authorities exhumed the bodies of the dead children, they found evidence of the hydrochloric acid poisoning that confirmed George's horrific account. Martha Randelle was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder. She maintained her innocence until the end, insisting she had only been trying to help cure the children of diphtheria. On October 6, 1909, Martha Randelle was hanged at Fremantle Prison, becoming the last woman executed in Western Australia. Her crimes shocked the nation and highlighted the vulnerability of children in an era when child protection laws were virtually non-existent. The case of Martha Randelle serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most innocent facades. Here was a woman who presented herself as a caring stepmother who convinced a grieving widower that she loved his children and who managed to fool doctors and neighbors while systematically torturing children to death. Her crimes were not crimes of passion or mental breakdown, but calculated acts of cruelty carried out over months with methodical precision. Our journey into darkness now takes us to Iran in the early 2000s, where we encounter Saeed Hanai, known as the Spider Killer. Born in 1962, Hanai was a construction worker and war veteran who lived in the holy city of Mashhad with his wife and 3 children. To his neighbors and family, he appeared to be a devout Muslim, a hard worker, and a dedicated family man. But beneath this respectable exterior lurked a killer who would claim the lives of at least 16 women while believing he was doing God's work. Hanai's killing spree began in August 2000 and continued until his arrest in July 2001. His victims were all sex workers, women who operated in the shadows of Iranian society, often driven to prostitution by poverty, drug addiction, or desperation. Hanai viewed these women as corrupting influences on his holy city, and he appointed himself as their judge, jury, and executioner. His twisted logic convinced him that by killing these women, he was cleansing Mashhad of moral pollution and serving a religious purpose. The Spider Killer's method was as cold as it was effective. He would approach sex workers on the streets of Mashhad, often late at night when they were most vulnerable and desperate for clients. Using his ordinary appearance and calm demeanor to gain their trust, he would negotiate a price and convince them to accompany him to what he claimed was a private location. Instead of taking them to hotels or other typical venues, he would bring them to his own home when his wife and children were away. Once the women were in his house, Hanai would attack them without warning. His preferred method of killing was strangulation, often using the women's own headscarves or chadors as murder weapons. There was a particularly cruel irony in this choice, as he was using symbols of Islamic modesty to kill women he deemed immodest. After murdering his victims, he would wrap their bodies in their chadors and dispose of them in various locations around Mashhad, often leaving them in sewers, vacant lots, or by roadsides. What made Hanai's crimes particularly disturbing was his complete lack of remorse. When questioned by police after his arrest, he showed no emotion about the deaths of his victims. Instead, He spoke about them as if they were insects he had exterminated, referring to them as worthless and claiming they deserved to die. He told investigators that he had been doing society a favor by removing these women from the streets, and he expressed regret only that he had not been able to kill more. The investigation into the spider killer's crimes was complicated by the social status of his victims. Sex workers in Iran operate in a legal and social gray area, often without family support or official documentation of their activities. This meant that many of Hanaye's victims were not immediately reported missing, and when their bodies were discovered, there was sometimes little initial investigation. The marginalized status of his victims allowed Hanaye to kill repeatedly without attracting immediate attention from authorities. Hanaye's capture came about through a combination of police work and luck. Authorities had noticed the pattern of murdered sex workers and began investigating connections between the crimes. They eventually traced Hanaye through witness testimony and surveillance footage that placed him in the vicinity of several murders. When police searched his home, they found evidence linking him to multiple victims, including personal belongings and forensic evidence that tied him conclusively to the crimes. During his trial, Hanaye's case became a symbol of larger social issues in Iranian society. Some conservative elements viewed him as a vigilante who had taken justice into his own hands, while others saw him as a cold-blooded killer who had used religion to justify murder. His defense attorney even argued that Islamic law supported his actions, claiming that the victims were corrupting society and deserved death. This argument was ultimately rejected by the court, but it highlighted the complex social dynamics surrounding the case. Saeed Hanaye was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging on April 8, 2002, in Mashhad prison. His crimes had a lasting impact on Iranian society, sparking debates about women's rights, social justice, and the treatment of marginalized populations. The case also inspired several films and documentaries that explored the social conditions that enabled his crimes and the complex reactions they provoked in Iranian society. The story of the spider killer reveals how social prejudice and religious extremism can create the perfect conditions for serial murder. Hanaye was able to kill repeatedly because his victims were seen as disposable by society, and his twisted interpretation of religious duty gave him a sense of righteousness about his crimes. His case serves as a warning about what can happen when marginalized populations are dehumanized and when religious or moral extremism is allowed to justify violence. Our next stop brings us to Soviet-era Moscow, where we encounter Vasily Komarov, also known as the Wolf of Moscow. Born in 1871 as Vasily Terentievich Petrov, Komarov operated during a period of massive social upheaval in Russia, killing at least 33 men between 1921 and 1923. His crimes took place during the early years of the Soviet Union, when society was still reeling from revolution, civil war, and economic collapse. In this chaotic environment, Komarov found the perfect conditions to pursue his deadly hobby. Komarov came from a background of poverty and violence that seemed to predestine him for a life of crime. Born into a large family plagued by alcoholism, he began drinking at the age of 15 and showed early signs of violent behavior. He served in the Russian army and later joined the Red Army during the Revolution, even rising to the rank of platoon commander. This military experience gave him organizational skills and a familiarity with violence that he would later use in his criminal career. After the revolution, Komarov settled in Moscow and established himself as a horse trader, a profession that put him in contact with many potential victims. The horse market in Moscow was a bustling place where men from all walks of life came to buy and sell animals. Komarov used this environment to identify victims, typically targeting men who appeared to have money and who were unfamiliar with the city. His victims were often farmers, merchants, or other traders who had come to Moscow to conduct business. The Wolf of Moscow's method was brutally efficient. He would approach potential victims at the horse market, striking up conversations about horses and business. Once he had identified a suitable target, he would invite the man to see a horse he claimed to have for sale at his stable. The stable, located near his home, became Komarov's killing ground. Once there, he would offer his victim vodka, claiming it was part of the traditional bargaining process. When the victim's guard was down, Komarov would attack from behind with a hammer or strangle them with wire. After killing his victims, Komarov would strip them of their clothing and valuables, then stuff their bodies into large sacks. These sacks were tied with distinctive knots that Komarov had learned during his years working with horses. The bodies were then disposed of in various locations around Moscow, including the Moskva River, construction sites, and vacant lots. Many of the bodies were never recovered, making it difficult for authorities to determine the full extent of his crimes. What made Komarov particularly dangerous was his systematic approach to murder. He kept detailed mental records of his crimes and showed remarkable organization in disposing of evidence. Unlike many serial killers who eventually become careless or leave obvious clues, Komarov was methodical and careful. He chose victims who were unlikely to be immediately missed, disposed of bodies in locations where they might never be found, and maintained a normal appearance to his neighbors and community. The investigation into Komarov's crimes began when police noticed a pattern in the discovery of bodies around Moscow. The distinctive way the sacks were tied and the presence of horse-related materials led investigators to focus on the horse trading community. In March 1923, police conducting a routine inspection of Komarov's property for illegal alcohol discovered his latest victim hidden under hay in his stable. Komarov attempted to escape by jumping from a window, but was quickly apprehended. During interrogation, Komarov confessed to killing 33 men, though he was only convicted of 29 murders due to lack of evidence for the additional cases. What shocked investigators was his matter-of-fact attitude toward the killings. He described murder as an awfully easy job and showed no remorse for his victims. He led police to several undiscovered burial sites and provided detailed descriptions of crimes that demonstrated his photographic memory for violence. Komarov's wife, Sophia, was also implicated in the crimes and found guilty as an accomplice. Investigators determined that she must have known about her husband's activities, as the murders took place in a stable adjacent to their home. Some accounts suggest that she even began participating in the killings toward the end of Komarov's spree. Both Vasily Komarov and his wife were sentenced to death and executed by firing squad on June 18, 1923. The case of the Wolf of Moscow represents one of the earliest documented examples of serial killing in the Soviet Union. Komarov's crimes took place during a period when the new Soviet state was still establishing effective law enforcement, and his case helped shape early Soviet approaches to criminal investigation. His methodical approach to murder and his ability to operate undetected for years made him one of the most successful serial killers of his era. What makes Komarov's story particularly chilling is how he was able to use the social chaos of post-revolutionary Russia to his advantage. In a society where people regularly disappeared due to political persecution, war, or economic displacement, the disappearance of his victims attracted little immediate attention. He exploited the trust inherent in traditional Russian business culture, where deals were often sealed with vodka and handshakes to lure victims to their deaths. Our final journey takes us to Yemen in the 1990s, where we encounter Abdullah Al-Hubal, a serial killer whose crimes spanned nearly a decade, and whose story reflects the complex political and social dynamics of modern Yemen. Al-Hubal's killing spree began in 1990, coinciding with Yemeni reunification, and continued until his violent death in a shootout with police in 1998. His case demonstrates how political instability and weak law enforcement can create conditions that allow serial killers to operate with impunity. Al-Hubal was first imprisoned in Aden in 1990 for the murder of 7 people, but the specific details of these initial crimes remain largely undocumented in publicly available records. What is known is that he managed to escape from custody and remained at large for several years, during which time he likely continued killing. His ability to evade capture for so long speaks to both his cunning and the limitations of law enforcement in newly unified Yemen. The end of Al-Hubal's criminal career came in August 1998 when he killed a couple in Bait al-Faqih. This double murder was witnessed by 3 other people whom Al-Hubal then killed to eliminate potential witnesses. This decision to kill witnesses demonstrated a ruthless pragmatism that characterized his approach to crime. Rather than fleeing immediately after the initial murders, he chose to stay and eliminate anyone who could identify him, showing a cold calculation that made him particularly dangerous. Al-Hubal's final confrontation with law enforcement occurred on August 16, 1998, when police tracked him down and attempted to arrest him. Rather than surrender, he chose to fight, engaging in a gun battle with officers that resulted in the death of 1 policeman and injuries to several others. His willingness to kill law enforcement officers showed that he had crossed every possible line and was prepared to use deadly force against anyone who threatened his freedom. The shootout that ended Al-Hubal's life marked the conclusion of an 8-year period of terror in Yemen. His death brought relief to communities that had lived in fear of his violence, but it also left many questions unanswered about the full extent of his crimes. The limited documentation of his case reflects the challenges of maintaining detailed criminal records in a country dealing with political instability and limited resources for law enforcement. What makes these 5 killers particularly disturbing is not just the brutality of their crimes, but the way they were able to operate in the shadows of history. Unlike the serial killers who have become household names, these individuals managed to commit horrific acts while remaining largely unknown to the wider world. Their stories remind us that evil exists in every society, in every era, and often in the most unexpected forms. Each of these killers has exploited specific vulnerabilities in their societies to continue their crimes. Christopher Worrell used the trusting nature of 1970s Australia, where hitchhiking was common and strangers were often given the benefit of the doubt. Martha Randelle exploited the limited medical knowledge of early 20th century Australia and the vulnerability of children in a society with few protections for them. Moving deeper into our journey through history's forgotten monsters, we encounter Martha Randelle, a woman whose name should be spoken alongside the most notorious female killers of all time, yet remains largely unknown outside of Australia. In the early 1900s, while the world was entering a new century filled with promise and progress, Martha was orchestrating one of the most methodical and cruel murder sprees ever documented. Her weapon of choice wasn't a knife or poison in the traditional sense, but something far more insidious and torturous. She used hydrochloric acid, commonly known as spirits of salts, to slowly and agonizingly kill her stepchildren by swabbing their throats, creating inflammation that would prevent them from eating, effectively starving them to death over weeks of excruciating pain. Martha had moved in with Thomas Morris in East Perth after following him from Adelaide, South Australia. She demanded that his 5 children call her mother, but her version of motherhood was a nightmare beyond imagination. The children lived in constant terror, subjected to brutal abuse and increasingly harsh punishments for the smallest infractions. What made Martha particularly dangerous was her ability to mask her cruelty behind the facade of medical care. When the children began showing symptoms of throat ailments, she convinced everyone, including their father, that she was treating them for diphtheria. Whilst the reality was far more sinister, she was the one causing their suffering, methodically applying acid to their throats while pretending to be their caregiver. The first victim was 9-year-old Annie, who died on July 28, 1907, after weeks of agony. The local doctor, believing Martha's story about treating diphtheria, attributed the death to the disease. 7-year-old Olive followed, succumbing to similar throat afflictions that left her unable to eat or drink without excruciating pain. Then came Arthur, Thomas's son, whose death finally began to raise suspicions. The pattern was becoming clear to those who looked closely enough, but Martha's manipulation of the medical narrative had been so thorough that she continued to operate with impunity. Each death was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, as she played the role of the grieving stepmother while secretly reveling in the power she held over life and death. The truth began to unravel when George, another of Morris's children, experienced similar symptoms and bravely escaped to his biological mother. His testimony to police about how his stepmother had killed his siblings and was trying to poison him with spirits of salts finally triggered an official investigation. When authorities examined Martha's purchases, they discovered she had bought large quantities of hydrochloric acid during the periods when the children were ill. The exhumation of the children's bodies revealed inflammation and hemorrhage consistent with corrosive poisoning. A neighbor's testimony about seeing Martha swabbing Arthur's throat through a window, hearing his screams, and smelling the burning chemical fumes provided the final pieces of evidence needed for conviction. During her trial, Martha maintained her innocence, insisting she was only treating the children for diphtheria. However, the evidence was overwhelming, and experiments conducted on animals showed the same pathological effects found in the children's bodies. She was sentenced to death, and became the last woman to be hanged in Western Australia on October 6, 1909. Her case remains one of the most chilling examples of familial murder, demonstrating how trust and authority can be weaponized by those with the darkest intentions. The fact that she operated under the guise of medical care makes her crimes particularly disturbing, as she exploited the most fundamental human instinct, the desire to help sick children. Our next subject takes us to the holy city of Mashhad, Iran, where between 2000 and 2001, a construction worker named Saeed Hana'eh embarked on what he called a religious crusade. Known as the Spider Killer, Hana'eh murdered at least 16 female sex workers, claiming he was cleansing the city of moral corruption. What makes his case particularly chilling is not just the brutality of his crimes, but the way he manipulated religious ideology to justify his actions and the disturbing support he received from certain segments of society. Hana'eh believed he was doing God's work, viewing his victims as worthless as cockroaches, and proudly stating that if he hadn't been caught, he would have killed 150 more women. Hana'eh's method was as calculated as it was cruel. He would lure his victims to his home when his wife and children were away, offering them money for services. Once inside, he would strangle them with their own headscarves, then wrap their bodies in chadors before dumping them by roadsides or in open sewers. The systematic nature of his kills and his ability to maintain a normal family life while committing these atrocities speaks to a level of compartmentalization that is truly terrifying. His wife and children had no idea that their husband and father was one of Iran's most prolific serial killers, operating literally under their roof. The societal reaction to Hana'eh's crimes revealed deep fractures within Iranian society. While reformists condemned him as a savage, a disturbing number of hardliners viewed him as a well-intentioned vigilante who was cleaning up the streets. This support was so pronounced that crowds gathered outside his house on the day of his arrest, not to condemn him, but to show solidarity. During his trial, Hana'eh showed no remorse, proudly defending his actions as a holy war against vice. His lawyer even attempted to use Islamic law provisions about sinners being a waste of blood to argue for lenient treatment. This legal strategy, while ultimately unsuccessful, highlighted the dangerous intersection of religious extremism and vigilante violence. The Spider Killer's reign of terror ended when he was arrested in July 2001, but his impact on Iranian society continues to reverberate today. His case has been the subject of multiple films and documentaries, including Ali Abbasi's Holy Spider, which explores not just his crimes, but the societal attitudes that enabled them. Hana'eh was executed by hanging on April 8, 2002, but his legacy raises uncomfortable questions about how religious ideology can be twisted to justify the most heinous acts. His story serves as a stark reminder that evil often hides behind righteous facades, and that society's most vulnerable members are frequently the targets of those who claim to be protecting moral order. From the religious extremism of Iran, we travel to the chaos of post-revolutionary Russia, where Vasily Komarov, known as the Wolf of Moscow, carved out his own reign of terror between 1921 and 1923. Operating during a time when the Soviet Union was still finding its footing and law enforcement was struggling to establish effective systems, Komarov confessed to murdering 33 men, making him one of the earliest documented serial killers in Soviet history. His crimes were particularly methodical and cold-blooded, leading him to describe killing as an awfully easy job, a statement that reveals the complete absence of human empathy that defined his character. Komarov's background reads like a blueprint for creating a monster. Born into poverty in 1871, he came from a large family plagued by alcoholism and dysfunction. He began drinking at 15 and spent years drifting through various occupations and regions, accumulating a history of violence and criminal behavior. Despite appearing to be a happily married family man to his neighbors, he was extremely abusive to his wife and children, even attempting to kill his 8-year-old son. This duality, the public face of respectability masking private brutality, would become a hallmark of his criminal career and allowed him to operate undetected for years. As a horse trader in Moscow, Komarov developed a chillingly efficient method for luring and killing his victims. He would invite prospective buyers to his stable, offer them vodka, and then, when their backs were turned, bludgeon them with a hammer or strangle them with wire. The bodies were then placed in sacks and tied with knots, typically used for harnessing horses, a detail that would eventually help police identify him. These sacks containing naked corpses were disposed of throughout Moscow, in vacant lots, construction sites, or dumped into the Moskva River. The regularity of these discoveries, occurring every Thursday or Saturday, finally caught police attention and triggered a 2-year investigation. The end came for Komarov in March 1923, when police conducting a routine inspection for illegal alcohol discovered his latest victim hidden under hay in his stable. He attempted to escape by jumping out a window, but was quickly apprehended. During interrogation, he freely confessed to 33 murders, leading police to additional undiscovered bodies. His wife, Sophia, was also found guilty as an accomplice, as investigators determined she couldn't have been unaware of the activities occurring in the stable next to their home. Both were sentenced to death and executed by firing squad on June 18, 1923, bringing an end to one of the most prolific killing sprees in early Soviet history. These forgotten monsters, Martha Randelle with her acid-soaked cloths, Said Hanai with his twisted religious justifications, and Vasily Komarov with his hammer and wire, remind us that evil takes many forms and operates in every corner of the world. Their stories, while disturbing, serve as crucial reminders of humanity's capacity for darkness and the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would exploit society's most vulnerable members. Now we turn to Martha Randelle, a woman whose name has been lost to history, despite committing some of the most heinous crimes ever recorded in Australian criminal history. In the early 1900s, while the world was entering a new century filled with promise and progress, Martha was quietly orchestrating a reign of terror that would make her the last woman executed in Western Australia. Her story isn't one of sudden violence or crimes of passion, but rather a calculated and methodical campaign of torture that lasted for years. She didn't use guns or knives. She didn't strangle or beat her victims. Instead, Martha Randelle chose a method so cruel, so deliberately prolonged, that it defies comprehension. She would take hydrochloric acid, commonly known as spirits of salts, and swab the throats of children while they screamed in agony. The acid would burn their throats so severely that they couldn't eat, couldn't drink, and would slowly starve to death over weeks of unimaginable suffering. Martha's victims weren't strangers. They were the children of her de facto husband, Thomas Morris, who had welcomed her into his home and trusted her to care for his 5 children. After separating from his wife, Thomas met Martha in Adelaide and brought her to live with him at 23 Robertson Street in East Perth. Martha insisted that all 5 children call her mother, but her version of motherhood was a nightmare beyond description. She saw these children not as innocent souls to protect and nurture, but as obstacles to eliminate. One by one, she began her systematic campaign of murder, starting with 9-year-old Annie Morris in July 1907. The child's death was initially attributed to diphtheria, a common childhood illness at the time. No one suspected that Martha had been slowly poisoning the little girl with acid, watching her waste away as her throat burned and she couldn't swallow food. 7-year-old Olive Morris was next. Like her sister before her, Olive began experiencing mysterious throat problems that doctors couldn't properly diagnose. Martha would appear to be caring for the child, administering what she claimed was medicine for diphtheria. In reality, she was repeatedly swabbing the child's throat with hydrochloric acid, each application causing excruciating pain and further damage. Neighbors would later testify to hearing the children's screams coming from the Morris house, but at the time, no one understood what was happening behind those walls. The acid would cause such severe inflammation that the children couldn't eat solid food and eventually couldn't swallow anything at all. They would slowly starve to death while Martha watched, maintaining the facade of a concerned stepmother tending to sick children. Olive died in agony, just as her sister had, with the official cause of death listed as complications from throat disease. The final victim was Arthur Morris, Thomas's son, whose death in 1908 would finally expose Martha's horrific crimes. Arthur's suffering was witnessed by a neighbor who happened to look through a window at the wrong moment. She saw Martha holding the boy down while she swabbed his throat with a bottle of clear liquid. The neighbor heard Arthur's agonized screams and smelled the acrid fumes of the acid, but still didn't fully understand what she was witnessing. Arthur would die just like his sisters, slowly and painfully, unable to eat or drink as his throat was destroyed by repeated acid burns. But this time, there was a witness, and when young George Morris ran away to his biological mother and told her that his stepmother was poisoning the children, the horrific truth finally began to emerge. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Martha's crimes. Police discovered that she had been purchasing large quantities of hydrochloric acid during the periods when the children were ill. When the bodies were exhumed for autopsy, they showed clear signs of corrosive poisoning with severe inflammation and hemorrhaging of the throat and digestive tract. To prove their theory, investigators conducted experiments on rabbits and guinea pigs, swabbing their throats with hydrochloric acid and documenting the results. The animals showed identical pathological changes to those found in the children's bodies. The evidence was overwhelming, but Martha never confessed. Even as she was led to the gallows on October 6, 1909, she maintained her innocence, claiming she had only been treating the children for diphtheria. Moving from the calculated cruelty of Martha Randelle to the religious fanaticism of our next killer, we encounter Saeed Hanai, known as the Spider Killer of Mashhad. In the holy city of Mashhad, Iran, between 2000 and 2001, a construction worker named Saeed Hanai was conducting what he believed to be a sacred mission. To the outside world, he appeared to be a devoted family man, married with 3 children, working hard to provide for his household. But behind this facade of normalcy, Heinous was systematically hunting and killing women he deemed morally corrupt. His victims were sex workers, drug addicts, and women he considered to be living sinful lives. In his twisted mind, he wasn't committing murder, he was performing a religious duty, cleansing the holy city of what he saw as human filth. He would later tell investigators that these women were worthless as cockroaches and that killing them was an act of devotion to God. Heinous' method was as calculated as it was cruel. He would cruise the streets of Mashhad in his motorcycle, looking for vulnerable women. When he found a target, he would approach them with offers of money or drugs, luring them back to his home when his wife and children were away. Once inside, he would engage them in conversation, sometimes for hours, before making his move. He would strangle them with their own headscarves, watching the life drain from their eyes as he held them down. After the killing, he would wrap their bodies in their chadors and transport them to remote locations around the city. Some bodies were dumped by roadsides, others in open sewers, and some were never found at all. The Iranian press dubbed him the Spider Killer because of the way he lured his victims into his web of death. The first victim was 30-year-old Afsaneh Karimpour, who disappeared in August 2000. Her body was found days later, wrapped in her chador and dumped in a sewer. Initially, police didn't connect her death to what would become a pattern of murders. As more bodies appeared with frightening regularity, always following the same pattern, investigators began to realize they were dealing with a serial killer. The victims were all women aged between 20 and 50, most with criminal records for drug use or prostitution. The indifference of some authorities and much of the public toward these victims created an environment where Heinous could operate with horrifying impunity. Because his victims were considered by many to be the dregs of society, their deaths didn't generate the same urgency or resources that other murders might have received. What made Heinous' case particularly disturbing was the reaction of some segments of Iranian society to his crimes. When he was finally arrested in July 2001, crowds of supporters gathered outside his house. Some viewed him as a vigilante hero who was cleaning up the streets and protecting moral values. During his trial, Heinous showed no remorse whatsoever. He proudly declared that he was fighting a crusade against vice and stated that if he hadn't been caught, he would have wanted to kill 150 more women. His lawyer even attempted to use Islamic law as a defense, arguing that because his victims were sinners, they were essentially worthless and that Heinous deserved lenient treatment for his role as a self-appointed moral enforcer. This defense was ultimately rejected, but the fact that it was even attempted reveals the deeply troubling attitudes toward women and morality that existed in certain segments of society. Heinous confessed to killing 16 women, though police suspected he may have been responsible for as many as 19 deaths. His victims included mothers, daughters, and sisters who had fallen into addiction or prostitution, often due to poverty, abuse, or desperation. Each had a story, a life that was cut short by a man who had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. The case exposed deep divisions within Iranian society about women's rights, moral corruption, and the role of vigilante justice. Reformists condemned Hanae as a savage and called for addressing the root causes of prostitution and addiction, while hardliners quietly sympathized with his mission. The Spider Killer was executed by hanging on April 8, 2002, but his case continues to be studied and depicted in films as an example of how religious extremism and societal attitudes can create monsters. Our journey through these forgotten killers now takes us to post-revolutionary Russia, where chaos and upheaval created the perfect hunting ground for Vasily Komarov, known as the Wolf of Moscow. In the early 1920s, as the Soviet Union was still finding its footing after the collapse of the Russian Empire, Moscow was a city where life was cheap and people disappeared regularly without much investigation. It was in this environment that Komarov, a horse trader, began what would become one of the most prolific killing sprees in early Soviet history. Between 1921 and 1923, the seemingly ordinary businessman systematically murdered at least 29 men, though he confessed to killing 33. His victims were customers, men who came to buy horses and instead found themselves facing a hammer-wielding killer who described murder as an awfully easy job. Komarov was born Vasily Terentievich Petrov in 1871 in the Vitebsk Governorate, into a large, impoverished family plagued by alcoholism. His childhood was marked by violence and neglect, and he began drinking heavily at age 15. After serving in the Russian army and spending time in the Far East, where he squandered money and served prison time for robbery, he settled in Riga with a Polish widow named Sofia. To his neighbors, they appeared to be a happy family with 2 children, but behind closed doors, Komarov was violently abusive. He once attempted to kill his 8-year-old son and regularly beat his wife. When the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, Komarov joined the Red Army and even rose to the rank of platoon commander, demonstrating the organizational skills and capacity for violence that would later serve him in his criminal career. Komarov's killing method was brutally efficient and terrifyingly consistent. He would approach potential victims at the horse markets of Moscow, engaging them in conversation about purchasing animals. Once he had gained their trust, he would invite them back to his stable to examine the horses more closely. The stable, located next to his family home, became his killing ground. He would offer his victims vodka to lower their guard, and then, when their backs were turned, he would strike them with a hammer or strangle them with wire. The violence was swift and decisive, but what came next revealed the true depth of his methodical madness. He would strip the bodies naked and stuff them into sacks, tying them with the same knots used for harnessing horses. This signature would eventually become a crucial clue for investigators. The disposal of bodies became a routine for Komarov. He would load the sacks containing his victims into his cart and transport them to various locations around Moscow under cover of darkness. Some were dumped in vacant lots, others at construction sites, and many were thrown into the Moskva River. The bodies that were discovered appeared with disturbing regularity, particularly on Thursdays and Saturdays, leading police to begin looking for patterns. The distinctive way the sacks were tied and the presence of oats found with some bodies eventually led investigators to focus on the horse trading community. For nearly 2 years, Komarov continued his killing spree, murdering men who had simply come to buy horses and instead became victims of his inexplicable rage. The end came in March 1923, when police conducting a routine inspection for illegal alcohol at Komarov's home discovered his latest victim hidden under hay in the stable. Komarov attempted to escape by jumping out of a window but was quickly apprehended. During interrogation, he confessed freely to killing 33 men, showing investigators where some of the undiscovered bodies could be found. His wife, Sophia, was also arrested and found guilty as an accomplice, as investigators determined she could not have been unaware of the murders taking place in the stable next to their home. Both were sentenced to death and executed by firing squad on June 18, 1923, bringing an end to one of the most prolific killing sprees in early Soviet history. Finally, we come to perhaps the most obscure killer on our list, Abdullah Al-Hubal from Yemen, whose crimes spanned nearly a decade from 1990 to 1998. Al-Hubal's story is fragmented and poorly documented, which is exactly why most people have never heard of him despite his reported victim count of 13 people. His criminal career began in 1990, shortly after Yemeni reunification, when he was first imprisoned in Aden for murdering 7 individuals. The specific details of these initial murders remain largely unknown, lost to poor record-keeping and the chaos of a newly unified nation struggling with political instability. What we do know is that Al-Hubal managed to escape from custody and remained at large for several years, free to continue his killing spree while authorities struggled to track him down. Al-Hubal's final spree began in August 1998 when he killed a couple in Bait al-Faqih. But what made this particular crime even more horrific was his decision to eliminate witnesses. 3 other people who had the misfortune of witnessing the double murder were also killed, demonstrating a ruthless calculation that went beyond simple murder into the realm of mass killing to cover his tracks. This incident showed that Al-Hubal was not just a killer, but a strategic thinker who understood the importance of leaving no witnesses behind. His willingness to kill innocent bystanders revealed a complete disregard for human life and a level of planning that made him extremely dangerous. The end of Al-Hubal's reign of terror came swiftly after these murders. On August 16, 1998, police finally caught up with him, but he wasn't going to be taken alive. In a violent firefight with law enforcement, Al-Hubal killed 1 policeman and wounded several others before being shot dead by the police. His death brought an end to 8 years of murder and mayhem, but it also ensured that many questions about his crimes would never be answered. The lack of detailed records from his case means that we may never know the full extent of his victims or understand what drove him to kill. His story serves as a reminder that in some parts of the world, serial killers can operate with relative impunity, their crimes poorly documented and quickly forgotten by history. These 5 killers represent different eras, different cultures, and different methods, but they share common threads that connect them across time and geography. Each exploited the vulnerabilities of their societies, whether it was the chaos of post-revolutionary Russia, the moral rigidity of theocratic Iran, the limited forensic capabilities of early 20th century Australia, or the political instability of Yemen. They remind us that evil is not confined to any particular time or place, but rather represents a dark constant in human nature that can emerge anywhere, anytime, often in the most unexpected forms. Welcome back to our exploration of the world's most forgotten monsters. We've already uncovered the horrifying truths about Christopher Worrell's calculated brutality in the Australian outback, Martha Randelle's methodical poisoning of innocent children, and Saeed Hanai's religiously motivated killing spree in Iran. Now we turn our attention to the frozen streets of early Soviet Moscow, where chaos and revolution provided the perfect cover for one of history's most prolific and systematic killers. The year was 1921. Moscow was still reeling from the Russian Revolution. The Civil War had just ended, and the new Soviet government was struggling to maintain order in a city where violence had become commonplace. Food was scarce, law enforcement was inconsistent, and people disappeared regularly without anyone asking too many questions. It was in this environment of upheaval and uncertainty that a man named Vasily Komarov began what would become one of the most methodical murder sprees in Russian history. Komarov, also known as Vasily Ivanovich Komarov, wasn't your typical serial killer driven by sexual deviance or psychological compulsion. He was a businessman, a horse trader who had found a way to combine profit with murder in the most calculating way imaginable. Born Vasily Terentievich Petrov in 1871 in the Vitebsk Governorate, he came from a family plagued by poverty and alcoholism. His childhood was marked by violence and neglect, with multiple siblings struggling with drink and his parents unable to provide basic stability. By the age of 15, Komarov had already begun drinking heavily, following the destructive pattern that seemed to run in his family. He served 4 years in the Russian army, an experience that likely taught him discipline and organizational skills that he would later apply to his criminal activities. After his military service, he traveled to the Far East, where he managed to accumulate a small fortune through various business dealings, only to lose it all through gambling and poor decisions. This period also saw his first serious brush with the law when he was imprisoned for robbing a military warehouse. It was after this setback that Komarov moved to Riga, where he married a Polish widow named Sofia. To their neighbors, they appeared to be a normal, if unremarkable, family. Sofia had children from her previous marriage, and together they seemed to represent the kind of working-class respectability that was common in pre-revolutionary Russia. However, behind closed doors, Komarov was a different man entirely. He was violently abusive toward his wife and stepchildren, once even attempting to kill his 8-year-old stepson in a drunken rage. When the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, Komarov saw opportunity in the chaos. He joined the Red Army and quickly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a platoon commander. This position gave him authority, respect, and most importantly, it taught him how to kill efficiently and without emotion. The civil war that followed provided him with ample opportunity to practice violence on a massive scale, and by all accounts, he excelled at it. His fellow soldiers described him as fearless in combat, but noted something unsettling about the way he seemed to enjoy the killing. After the Civil War ended in 1921, Komarov found himself in Moscow with his family, trying to make a living in the new Soviet system. He returned to horse trading, a profession he had some experience with from his earlier years. The horse market in Moscow was a bustling place where farmers, traders, and anyone needing transportation would come to buy and sell animals. It was the perfect hunting ground for what Komarov had in mind. His method was deceptively simple and terrifyingly effective. Komarov would approach potential customers, At the horse market, usually men who appeared to have money and were shopping alone, he would strike up conversations, show them his horses, and gradually build their trust. He was described as charming and persuasive, able to convince buyers that he had exactly what they were looking for. The key was getting them to come back to his stable to complete the transaction. Komarov's stable was located in a somewhat isolated area near his home, perfect for what he had planned. Once he had lured a victim there, he would offer them vodka, a common practice in Russian business dealings. As the men relaxed, thinking they were about to make a good purchase, Komarov would wait for the perfect moment when their backs were turned. Then he would strike with a hammer, delivering crushing blows to the skull, or sometimes he would use a wire to strangle them. The attacks were swift, brutal, and almost always fatal. What happened next revealed the full extent of Komarov's methodical nature. He would strip the bodies completely naked, removing any identification or valuables. The corpses were then stuffed into large sacks, which he tied with a very specific type of knot used for harnessing horses. This detail would later become crucial evidence, as the knots were so distinctive that investigators realized they were looking for someone with extensive experience in horse handling. The disposal of the bodies showed the same calculated approach. Komarov would load the sacks onto his cart and transport them to various locations around Moscow. Some were dumped in vacant lots, others in construction sites, and many were thrown into the Moskva River. He varied his disposal locations to avoid creating a pattern that might alert the authorities. The naked bodies, when they were discovered, were often in such advanced states of decomposition that identification was nearly impossible. For over 2 years, from 1921 to 1923, this horrific routine continued. Komarov would go to the horse market, select a victim, lure them to his stable, kill them, and dispose of the body. He later confessed that he found killing to be an awfully easy job and showed no remorse whatsoever for his actions. The monetary gain from robbing his victims was certainly a motivation, but there seemed to be something deeper driving him, a genuine enjoyment of the power he held over life and death. The police began to notice a pattern when bodies started appearing with disturbing regularity, often on Thursdays or Saturdays. The distinctive way the sacks were tied, the presence of oats and hay on some of the bodies, and the fact that victims seemed to be men who had money all pointed towards someone connected to the horse trade. However, in the chaotic environment of early Soviet Moscow, with limited resources and investigative techniques, progress was slow. The investigation took nearly 2 years, during which time Komarov continued his killing spree unabated. Detectives focused their attention on the Zamoskvoriki district, where many of the bodies were being discovered. They began visiting horse traders and asking questions, trying to identify anyone who might fit the profile they had developed. Komarov, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly bold, perhaps feeling that the authorities were incapable of catching him. His downfall came in March 1923, not through brilliant detective work, but through a routine inspection. Authorities were conducting searches for illegal alcohol, which was heavily regulated under the new Soviet system. When they arrived at Komarov's home and stable, they were looking for bootleg vodka, not bodies. However, when they searched the stable, they discovered his latest victim hidden under a pile of hay. The man had been killed recently, and the evidence of murder was unmistakable. Realizing he had been caught, Komarov attempted to escape by jumping out of a window. However, he was quickly apprehended by the police officers on March 18th, 1923. What followed was one of the most shocking confessions in Russian criminal history. Rather than denying his crimes or trying to minimize his involvement, Komarov freely admitted to killing 33 men. He provided detailed descriptions of how he had committed each murder and even led police to locations where some of the undiscovered bodies could be found. During his interrogation, Komarov showed a chilling lack of remorse. He described his victims as if they were livestock, noting their physical characteristics and the amounts of money they had carried. He seemed proud of his efficiency and spoke about the murders as if they were business transactions. When asked why he had killed so many people, he simply said that it was easy money and that he enjoyed the process. The investigation that followed Komarov's confession revealed the full scope of his crimes. While he claimed to have killed 33 men, police were only able to verify 29 murders. 6 additional bodies that he described were never found, likely because they had been thrown into the river or buried in locations that had since been developed. The confirmed victims ranged in age from their 20s to their 50s, all men who had come to buy horses and had instead met their deaths. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the involvement of Komarov's wife, Sophia. Initially, she claimed to know nothing about her husband's activities, insisting that she had no idea what was happening in the stable next to their home. However, as the investigation progressed, it became clear that she had not only known about the murders, but had actively participated in some of them. Neighbors reported seeing her helping to move heavy sacks, and there was evidence that she had assisted in cleaning up after the killings. Sophia's exact level of involvement remains somewhat unclear from historical records, but she was ultimately charged as an accomplice to murder. Some accounts suggest that she began participating more actively in the killings during 1922, perhaps driven by the financial benefits or perhaps coerced by her husband's increasingly violent behavior. What is certain is that she could not have been unaware of what was happening, given the proximity of the stable to their living quarters and the regular appearance of blood and bodies. The trial of Vasily Komarov and his wife was one of the first major criminal cases to capture public attention in the new Soviet Union. The prosecution portrayed Komarov as a monster who had taken advantage of the post-revolutionary chaos to prey on innocent people. The defense attempted to argue that he was mentally ill, pointing to his family history of alcoholism and his own heavy drinking as evidence of psychological impairment. The doctors who examined him noted his complete lack of empathy and his apparent enjoyment of violence, but concluded that he understood the difference between right and wrong and was therefore responsible for his actions. This finding sealed his fate and that of his wife. The trial proceedings revealed additional disturbing details about Komarov's methodology. He had kept detailed mental records of his victims, remembering their names, the amounts of money they carried, and specific details about how each murder was committed. This level of organization suggested that his crimes were not impulsive acts of violence, but carefully planned executions designed to maximize profit while minimizing risk. On June 18, 1923, Both Vasily Komarov and Sofia were executed by firing squad in Moscow. Their deaths marked the end of one of the most systematic and calculated murder sprees in Russian history. Komarov showed no remorse, even as he faced execution, reportedly telling his guards that he regretted only that he had been caught before he could kill more people. The case of Vasily Komarov provides a chilling glimpse into how societal chaos can provide cover for the most heinous crimes. The post-revolutionary period in Russia was marked by violence, uncertainty, and a breakdown of traditional law enforcement structures. In this environment, a methodical killer like Komarov could operate for years without detection, preying on people who were simply trying to make honest livings in difficult times. What makes Komarov's crimes particularly disturbing is their businesslike nature. Unlike many serial killers who are driven by sexual compulsion or psychological disorders, Komarov seemed to view murder simply as an efficient way to make money. He had reduced human life to a commodity, calculating the profit potential of each victim and disposing of their bodies with the same care he might give to discarding used equipment. The legacy of Vasily Komarov extends beyond his individual crimes to represent a dark chapter in Russian history when the collapse of old systems and the struggle to establish new ones created opportunities for evil to flourish. His case became one of the first major criminal investigations in the Soviet Union and helped establish procedures for dealing with serial killers that would be used for decades to come. Today, Komarov is largely forgotten outside of Russia, overshadowed by more recent and better documented serial killers. However, his methodical approach to murder and his ability to operate undetected for over 2 years make him one of the most successful killers in terms of victim count and duration of activity. His 33 confirmed victims represent one of the highest body counts of any serial killer from that era. The story of Vasily Komarov serves as a reminder that evil can take many forms, and that the most dangerous killers are often those who appear most normal on the surface. His neighbors saw him as a successful businessman. His customers trusted him enough to follow him to isolated locations, and even the authorities initially had no reason to suspect him. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is how each killer exploited the vulnerabilities of their respective societies. The political instability following Yemen's reunification in 1990 created an environment where someone like Abdullah Al-Hubal could operate with terrifying efficiency. When law enforcement systems are stretched thin or in transition, predators emerge from the shadows. Al-Hubal's ability to escape from prison in Aden and remain free for years demonstrates how chaos breeds opportunity for those with murderous intent. His systematic elimination of witnesses shows a calculating mind that understood the weaknesses in Yemen's justice system during this turbulent period. The geographical spread of these killers also reveals something profound about human evil. From the industrial cities of Soviet Russia to the religious centers of Iran, from the suburbs of Australia to the remote regions of Yemen, serial killers have emerged across every continent and culture. This isn't coincidence. It's evidence that the capacity for systematic murder exists independently of religion, politics, or economic systems. Vasily Komarov operated during the chaos of post-revolutionary Russia, while Saeed Haneh killed during a period of religious conservatism in Iran. Christopher Worrell hunted during Australia's social transformation of the 1970s. Each found ways to exploit their specific environment. The methods these killers employed were often deeply personal and reflected their psychological landscapes. Martha Randelle's use of hydrochloric acid wasn't just about killing, it was about prolonging suffering. She could have poisoned her stepchildren quickly, but instead chose a method that would cause weeks of agony. The acid burned their throats, making it impossible to eat or drink, creating a slow starvation that she could watch unfold day by day. This wasn't murder born of passion or desperation. This was murder as entertainment, suffering as spectacle. Saeed Hanei's religious justifications reveal another disturbing pattern among serial killers: the ability to transform personal pathology into moral crusade. He didn't see himself as a murderer, but as a cleanser, a holy warrior purifying his city of corruption. This self-righteousness made him even more dangerous because it removed any internal barriers to killing. When someone believes God wants them to kill, there's no limit to the horror they can justify. His supporters, who gathered outside his house, understood this twisted logic, seeing him not as a criminal, but as someone doing necessary work. The investigation techniques used to catch these killers varied dramatically based on the era and location. Vasily Komarov was caught through old-fashioned detective work, police noticing patterns in how bodies were tied and disposed of, connecting the murders to the horse market through physical evidence. Christopher Worrell's capture involved modern forensic techniques and coordinated police work across state lines. The difference in investigative capabilities between 1920s Moscow and 1970s Australia shows how criminal justice evolved, but also how killers adapted their methods accordingly. What's particularly chilling about Martha Randelle's case is how she weaponized the role of caregiver. Stepmothers were already viewed with suspicion in early 20th century Australia, but Randelle used this stereotype as camouflage. When children complained about their throats hurting, she could present herself as the concerned mother figure, administering what appeared to be medicine. The very relationship that should have protected these children became the vehicle for their destruction. She turned healing into harming, care into cruelty. The international nature of these crimes also highlights how evil transcends borders. While each killer operated within their specific cultural context, their fundamental motivations, power, control, sexual gratification, religious fanaticism, financial gain, remained remarkably consistent. Abdullah Al-Hubal's willingness to kill witnesses shows the same cold calculation as Vasily Komarov's systematic disposal of bodies. Martha Randelle's prolonged torture of children reveals the same sadistic pleasure as Saeed Hanei's strangulation of women. The role of accomplices in these cases raises disturbing questions about complicity and willful blindness. Komarov's wife, Sophia, was executed alongside her husband, deemed guilty of helping facilitate his murders. How could she not have known what was happening in the stable next to their home? Similarly, questions lingered about David Hill's knowledge of Christopher Worrell's activities. These cases suggest that serial killers rarely operate in complete isolation. They often have enablers, people who choose not to see, not to ask questions, not to intervene. The media coverage of these killers varied dramatically based on their cultural context. Saeed Hanei became a polarizing figure in Iranian society, with some viewing him as a villain and others as a misguided hero. Martha Randelle was portrayed as the archetypal wicked stepmother, fitting neatly into existing social narratives about female evil. Christopher Worrell's crimes were sensationalized as part of Australia's growing awareness of serial killing as a phenomenon. Each society processed these crimes through its own moral and cultural framework. The timing of these murders often coincided with periods of social upheaval or transition. Komarov killed during the chaos following the Russian Revolution. Al-Hubal's crimes spanned the period around Yemeni reunification. Worrell operated during Australia's Cultural Revolution of the 1970s. This isn't coincidental. Social instability creates opportunities for predators, periods when normal safeguards break down, when people are displaced or vulnerable, when law enforcement is distracted or overwhelmed. The victims of these killers were often society's most vulnerable members. Hanaye targeted sex workers, women already marginalized and criminalized. Komarov preyed on men desperate enough to travel alone to remote locations to buy horses. Randelle targeted children who had no power to resist or escape. Al-Hubal killed witnesses who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. These weren't random selections. They were calculated choices based on who was least likely to be missed or believed. The interrogation transcripts from these cases, where available, reveal the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt wrote about. Komarov described killing as awfully easy, discussing murder with the same casual tone someone might use to describe a routine task. Hanaye showed no remorse, expressing only regret that he hadn't killed more. These weren't monsters in the Hollywood sense. They were ordinary-looking people who had crossed a line most humans never approach, and found it surprisingly simple to keep crossing it. The forensic evidence in these cases tells its own story of advancing criminal science. Martha Randelle's conviction relied on primitive toxicology and witness testimony. By the time of Worrell's crimes, investigators had access to more sophisticated forensic techniques. The evolution of criminal investigation methods often runs parallel to the evolution of criminal methods, a constant arms race between those who seek to hide crimes and those who seek to solve them. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal common patterns despite their different cultural backgrounds. Most showed early signs of antisocial behavior, problems with authority, histories of violence or cruelty. Many had experienced childhood trauma or neglect, though millions of people suffer similar experiences without becoming killers. The transformation from damaged person to serial murderer involves choices, a series of decisions to cross moral boundaries that most people, even damaged people, never cross. The execution of these killers, where it occurred, often failed to provide the closure societies sought. Komarov and his wife faced firing squads in 1923. Martha Randelle was hanged in 1909. Saeed Hanaye was executed in 2002. Al-Hubal died in a shootout with police. Their deaths ended their killing sprees, but couldn't undo the trauma they inflicted on families, communities, and entire societies. The ripple effects of their crimes extended far beyond their immediate victims. The documentation of these cases varies wildly in quality and completeness. Some, like Martha Randelle's, are well documented through court records and newspaper coverage. Others, like Abdullah Al-Hubal's, exist primarily as brief mentions in crime databases and news reports. This disparity in documentation reflects broader inequalities in how different societies record and preserve criminal history. Some killers become infamous, while others fade into obscurity, not because their crimes were less heinous, but because their stories weren't told as widely. The families of these killers often became secondary victims, forever associated with names that became synonymous with evil. Komarov's children had to live with a father who was not only a mass murderer, but whose wife, possibly their mother or stepmother, was executed as his accomplice. The social stigma attached to these family connections could last for generations, innocent people carrying the burden of crimes they had no part in committing. The investigative challenges these cases presented often pushed law enforcement agencies to develop new techniques and approaches. The systematic nature of these crimes, the multiple jurisdictions sometimes involved, the need to connect seemingly unrelated deaths, all contributed to the evolution of criminal investigation methods. Each solved case became a learning experience for future investigations, though often at a terrible cost in human lives. The cultural impact of these killers extended beyond their immediate crimes into literature, film, and popular culture. Some became the subjects of books and documentaries, their stories told and retold, analyzed and dissected. Others remained obscure, known only to criminal justice professionals and researchers. The difference often depended more on timing, location, and media coverage than on the actual severity of their crimes. These 5 killers represent just a fraction of the serial murderers who have operated throughout history, but their cases illuminate broader truths about human nature, society, and evil itself. They remind us that the capacity for systematic murder exists across all cultures and historical periods, that ordinary-looking people can harbor extraordinary malevolence, and that the price of safety is eternal vigilance. As we delve deeper into the twisted psychology of these forgotten killers, one name stands out as perhaps the most chilling example of how evil can flourish in the shadows of society's indifference. Saeed Hana'eh, known as the Spider Killer, operated in the holy city of Mashhad, Iran, between 2000 and 2001, using religious extremism as his justification for the killing spree that would claim at least 16 lives. What makes his case particularly disturbing isn't just the brutal nature of his crimes, but the way he manipulated religious rhetoric to rationalize murder, and how segments of society actually supported his actions. In a city revered as one of Islam's holiest sites, Hana'eh turned faith into a weapon, transforming sacred beliefs into a twisted mandate for serial killing. Born into a world where religious fundamentalism and social conservatism created rigid expectations, Hana'eh appeared to be an ordinary man leading an unremarkable life. He worked as a construction laborer, was married, and had 3 children, presenting himself as a devout Muslim who attended prayers regularly and maintained the outward appearance of righteousness. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, religious man who seemed concerned about the moral decay he perceived in society. Behind this facade of piety, however, lurked a predator who had constructed an elaborate justification system for murder, convincing himself that he was doing God's work by eliminating what he saw as human filth from the earth. His victims were women working as prostitutes in Mashhad, many of whom had turned to sex work due to poverty, addiction, or desperation. These women, already marginalized by society and viewed with contempt by conservative elements, became easy targets for Hana'eh's twisted crusade. He would prowl the streets of Mashhad, often near the shrine of Imam Reza, identifying potential victims with the calculating eye of a predator. His method was deceptively simple, yet terrifyingly effective. He would approach these women, often when they were most vulnerable, and offer them money for sex, presenting himself as just another client seeking their services. The killing process itself revealed the depth of Hanae's depravity and his methodical approach to murder. He would lure his victims to his modest home on the outskirts of the city, timing his attacks for when his wife and children were away visiting relatives or running errands. Once inside, he would engage in conversation, sometimes even praying with his victims, using religious language to put them at ease before revealing his true intentions. The actual murders were carried out with chilling efficiency. He would strangle his victims with their own headscarves or chadors, watching the life drain from their eyes as he convinced himself he was performing a sacred duty. After each killing, Hanae would dispose of the bodies with the same methodical precision he brought to the murders themselves. He would wrap the corpses in the victim's own chadors, creating makeshift shrouds that he believed purified the act of disposal. The bodies were then transported to various locations around Mashhad, often dumped in open sewers, construction sites, or abandoned lots on the city's periphery. Some victims were discovered quickly, while others remained hidden for weeks or months, their decomposing remains serving as grim reminders of Hanae's ongoing campaign of terror. What distinguished Hanae from many other serial killers was his complete lack of shame about his actions and his willingness to discuss them openly once captured. During his interrogation and trial, he showed no remorse, instead expressing pride in what he called his holy mission to cleanse Mashhad of moral corruption. He described his victims using dehumanizing language, calling them cockroaches, and claiming they were worthless in the eyes of God. His confession was delivered with the fervor of a religious zealot, as he explained how he believed he was following divine commandments to purify the holy city. The investigation that led to Hanae's capture revealed the systematic nature of his crimes and the careful planning that went into each murder. Police noticed a pattern in the discovery of bodies, all involving women with similar backgrounds found in comparable states of decomposition and disposal. The breakthrough came when investigators began monitoring areas known for prostitution and noticed Hanae's repeated presence in these locations. Surveillance footage and witness testimonies gradually built a case against him, though the investigation was complicated by the social stigma surrounding the victims and the reluctance of some witnesses to come forward. When authorities finally arrested Hanae in July 2001, they discovered a man who was eager to confess and even boastful about his crimes. He freely admitted to killing 16 women and expressed regret only that he hadn't killed more before being caught. During questioning, he revealed the twisted logic that had driven his killing spree, explaining how he had convinced himself that eliminating prostitutes was equivalent to performing a religious service. His detailed confessions provided investigators with locations of additional bodies and insights into his methods, but also revealed the disturbing extent of his delusions. The most shocking aspect of Hanae's case wasn't just his crimes, but the public reaction to them. When news of his arrest spread, crowds gathered outside his home, but rather than expressing outrage, many voiced support for his actions. Conservative religious leaders and citizens praised him as a moral vigilante who had taken necessary action to clean up their holy city. This support emboldened Hanae's legal defense team, who argued that their client should be treated leniently because he had been performing a religious duty by eliminating sinners from society. The trial proceedings exposed deep divisions within Iranian society about morality, justice, and the treatment of marginalized women. Hanae's lawyers attempted to invoke Islamic law provisions that they claimed justified killing those who corrupted society, arguing that their client was a righteous man who had taken it upon himself to enforce divine will. They portrayed the victims as willing participants in immoral behavior who had brought their fate upon themselves through their life choices. This legal strategy reflected broader societal attitudes that devalued the lives of sex workers and other marginalized women. Despite the support from some quarters, the court ultimately rejected Hanae's religious justifications and found him guilty of multiple counts of murder. The judge recognized that allowing such defenses would essentially legalize vigilante killings and undermine the rule of law. However, the trial proceedings had already revealed the disturbing reality that significant portions of society viewed Hanae's victims as expendable and his actions as understandable, if not entirely justified. The case sparked intense debate about women's rights, social justice, and religious extremism in Iran. Progressive voices condemned Hanae as a savage murderer who had used religion to justify his psychopathic impulses, while conservative elements continued to view him as someone who had simply taken moral enforcement too far. This division highlighted the precarious position of vulnerable women in Iranian society and the dangerous consequences of dehumanizing rhetoric directed at marginalized populations. International attention focused on the case as an example of how religious extremism could be used to justify horrific crimes against women. Human rights organizations pointed to Hanae's case as evidence of the need for better protection of vulnerable populations and the dangers of allowing religious rhetoric to override basic human rights principles. The case became a symbol of the broader struggle between progressive and conservative forces in Iranian society. Hanae was sentenced to death and executed by hanging on April 8, 2002, at Mashhad prison just 9 months after his arrest. Even facing execution, he remained unrepentant, expressing his belief that he would be rewarded in the afterlife for his actions on earth. His final statements continued to reflect the twisted religiosity that had driven his killing spree, as he maintained that he had been doing God's work by eliminating corruption from the holy city. The Spider Killer's legacy extends far beyond his individual crimes, serving as a chilling reminder of how dangerous ideologies can transform ordinary people into monsters. His case demonstrates how religious extremism, social prejudice, and systemic discrimination can create environments where serial killers can operate with implicit societal approval. The fact that significant portions of society supported his actions reveals the deadly consequences of dehumanizing vulnerable populations and the importance of protecting human rights for all members of society, regardless of their social status or life circumstances. Today, Hanae's crimes continue to be studied by criminologists and social scientists as an example of ideologically motivated serial killing. His case illustrates how killers can use widely accepted social prejudices to justify their actions and even gain public support for their crimes. we've journeyed through the darkest corners of human nature, examining 5 killers whose names may not echo through popular culture, but whose crimes were no less horrifying than those of more famous monsters. These cases reveal a disturbing truth about evil. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or dramatic headlines. Instead, it often operates in shadows, exploiting the vulnerabilities of society and preying on those least likely to be missed or mourned. Christopher Worrell's story demonstrates how charm and charisma can mask the most sinister intentions. In 1970s Australia, when hitchhiking was common and trust came easier, Worrell used his disarming personality to lure young women to their deaths. His ability to blend into society, to appear normal and even appealing, allowed him to operate with terrifying efficiency. The systematic nature of his crimes, the careful selection of victims, and his methodical disposal of bodies reveal a mind that had completely divorced itself from human empathy. What makes Worrell particularly chilling is how ordinary he seemed to those around him, a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Martha Randelle's crimes strike at the very heart of what we consider sacred, the protection of children by those entrusted with their care. Her use of hydrochloric acid to slowly torture and kill her stepchildren represents a level of cruelty that defies comprehension. The fact that she maintained the facade of medical treatment while inflicting unimaginable agony reveals a psychological sophistication that makes her crimes even more disturbing. Randelle exploited not just the trust of innocent children, but also the medical ignorance of her time, using society's limited understanding of disease to mask her murderous activities. The case of Saeed Hanai exposes how ideological extremism can transform ordinary individuals into killers who believe themselves righteous. His targeting of sex workers in Mashhad wasn't random violence, but a calculated campaign driven by his twisted interpretation of religious duty. What makes Hanai's story particularly troubling is how his actions found support among certain segments of society who viewed his victims as deserving of death. This case reveals how societal prejudices and moral blind spots can enable serial killers to operate with reduced scrutiny, particularly when their victims come from marginalized communities. Vasily Komarov operated during one of history's most chaotic periods, exploiting the social upheaval of post-revolutionary Russia to prey on desperate men seeking to improve their lives through horse trading. His methodical approach to murder, combined with his complete lack of remorse, demonstrates how some individuals can view human life as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. Komarov's ability to compartmentalize his family life from his murderous activities shows the frightening capacity some people have for leading double lives, appearing normal to neighbors while committing atrocities in private. Abdullah Al-Hubal's crimes in Yemen illustrate how political instability and weak law enforcement can create environments where serial killers thrive. His ability to escape custody and continue killing for years highlights the challenges faced by authorities in regions plagued by conflict and institutional weakness. The limited information available about his crimes also demonstrates how some killers remain in the shadows, not by design, but due to the circumstances of their time and place. These 5 cases share common threads that reveal important truths about the nature of serial killing. Each killer exploited specific vulnerabilities in their society, Whether it was the trusting culture of 1970s Australia, the limited medical knowledge of early 20th century Perth, the religious extremism and social prejudices of Iran, the chaos of revolutionary Russia, or the political instability of Yemen. They remind us that serial killers are not supernatural beings, but human predators who adapt to their environments and exploit the weaknesses they find. The systematic nature of these crimes is perhaps most disturbing. None of these killers acted in moments of passion or temporary insanity. Instead, they developed methods, refined techniques, and continued killing until external forces stopped them. Worrell's careful selection and disposal of victims, Randelle's prolonged torture disguised as medical care, Hanae's ritualistic targeting of specific victim types, Komarov's methodical approach to luring and killing, and Al-Hubal's willingness to eliminate witnesses all demonstrate planning and forethought that challenges our understanding of mental illness as an explanation for such behavior. The response of society to these crimes also reveals troubling patterns. In several cases, the victims were chosen specifically because they were unlikely to be missed or because society viewed them as less valuable. Worrell targeted young women traveling alone. Randelle abused children who had no voice. Hanae killed sex workers whom many considered outcasts. Komarov preyed on desperate men seeking better lives, and Al-Hubal eliminated witnesses to avoid consequences. This targeting of the vulnerable exposes how social hierarchies and prejudices can inadvertently enable serial killers by creating populations of potential victims who receive less attention from law enforcement and society at large. The global nature of these crimes reminds us that evil is not confined to any particular culture, religion, or political system. From Australia to Iran, from early 20th century Perth to post-revolutionary Moscow, from stable democracies to war-torn regions, serial killers have emerged to prey upon their fellow humans. This universality suggests that the capacity for extreme evil exists within human nature itself, waiting for the right combination of circumstances, opportunity, and moral failure to manifest. What makes these lesser-known killers particularly significant is how they operated without the media attention that often accompanies more famous cases. They didn't seek publicity or fame. They simply wanted to kill. This absence of attention-seeking behavior makes their crimes even more chilling because it suggests a purer form of evil, one that exists for its own sake rather than for recognition or notoriety. They killed because they wanted to kill, not because they wanted to be remembered for killing. The investigative challenges presented by these cases also highlight the evolution of law enforcement techniques over time. Early cases like Randelle's and Komarov's were solved through basic detective work and witness testimony, while later cases benefited from more sophisticated forensic techniques. However, all of these cases ultimately relied on human observation, intuitive police work, and often chance discoveries to bring the killers to justice. This reminds us of the crucial role that alert citizens, dedicated investigators, and sometimes pure luck play in stopping serial killers. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal disturbing commonalities despite their different backgrounds and methods. Each demonstrated an ability to compartmentalize their crimes, maintaining normal facades while committing horrific acts. They showed no genuine remorse for their actions, often expressing pride or justification for their killings. Most importantly, they all demonstrated a fundamental inability to view their victims as fully human, reducing them to objects to be manipulated, tortured, or disposed of according to their twisted desires. The lasting impact of these crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Each case changed the communities where they occurred, creating lasting fears and suspicions that affected how people interacted with strangers and moved through their daily lives. The children who survived Randelle's abuse, the families of Worrell's victims, the sex workers of Mashhad who lived in fear of Hanai, the horse traders who had to reconsider their safety around Komarov, and the witnesses who feared Al-Hubal's reach all represent the broader human cost of serial killing that extends far beyond the direct victims. These cases also demonstrate the importance of believing victims and taking reports of abuse or suspicious behavior seriously. In several instances, warning signs were present but ignored or dismissed. Children's complaints about Randelle's medical treatments, reports of missing persons in Worrell's area, concerns about violence against sex workers in Hanai's territory, and patterns of disappearances around Komarov's activities all represented opportunities for earlier intervention that might have saved lives. The study of these lesser-known killers serves another crucial purpose. It reminds us that evil often operates in obscurity. While we focus on famous cases that capture media attention, countless other predators work in shadows, preying on victims whose stories never make headlines. This reality underscores the importance of maintaining vigilance, supporting vulnerable populations, and ensuring that law enforcement has the resources and training necessary to investigate suspicious disappearances and deaths regardless of the victim's social status. As we conclude our examination of these 5 forgotten monsters, we're left with uncomfortable questions about human nature and society's role in enabling or preventing such crimes. How many other Christopher Worrells, Martha Randelles, Saeed Hanaris, Vasily Komarovs, and Abdullah Al-Hubals have operated throughout history without being caught or documented? How many are operating right now, taking advantage of society's blind spots and vulnerable populations to satisfy their murderous urges? The answer to these questions should serve as a call to action. We must remain vigilant, protect the vulnerable, believe victims when they speak out, and ensure that law enforcement agencies have the resources they need to investigate suspicious activities. Most importantly, we must remember that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes or seek the spotlight of media attention. Sometimes, the most dangerous monsters are those we never hear about until it's too late. By studying these forgotten killers, we honor their victims' memories and arm ourselves with knowledge that might help prevent future tragedies. Evil may be a constant in human history, but our response to it doesn't have to be passive. As we reach the conclusion of our journey through these dark corridors of human depravity, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that evil often wears the most mundane disguises. Christopher Worrell, Martha Randelle, Saeed Hanai, Vasily Komarov, and Abdullah Al-Hubal were not the monsters of our nightmares. They were our neighbors, our fellow citizens, people who walked among us undetected for years. Their stories serve as a chilling reminder that the capacity for unspeakable cruelty can lurk behind the most ordinary facades, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal disturbing patterns that transcend geography and culture. Worrell's methodical approach to luring victims, Martha Randelle's calculated torture of children, Hanae's religious justifications for murder, Komarov's businesslike efficiency in disposal, and Al-Hubal's escalating violence all demonstrate how these individuals transformed their personal grievances into systematic campaigns of terror. Each developed their own twisted logic, their own internal justification for crossing the ultimate moral boundary. They didn't snap in moments of passion. They planned, they prepared, and they executed their crimes with a cold rationality that makes their actions even more terrifying. What makes these cases particularly haunting is how each killer exploited the specific vulnerabilities of their time and place. Worrell operated during Australia's more trusting era, when hitchhiking was a common and stranger danger wasn't yet a household concept. Martha Randelle took advantage of early 20th century medical ignorance, when child deaths were more common and less scrutinized. Hanae weaponized religious extremism in a society already divided by moral conflicts. Komarov thrived in the chaos of post-revolutionary Russia, where life was cheap and law enforcement was overwhelmed. Al-Hubal exploited the instability of a newly unified Yemen, where institutional weaknesses created opportunities for predators. The evolution of investigative techniques becomes starkly apparent when examining these cases across different eras. Komarov's crimes in the 1920s were solved through basic pattern recognition and physical evidence, while Worrell's later crimes benefited from more sophisticated forensic analysis and coordinated law enforcement efforts. However, the fundamental challenge remained the same: identifying patterns among seemingly random deaths and connecting them to a single perpetrator. In each case, it was often luck, witness testimony, or the killer's own mistakes that led to their capture, rather than advanced investigative methods. The societal impact of these crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Each case fundamentally altered the communities where they occurred, shattering the illusion of safety that allows societies to function. Parents became more protective of their children after learning about Martha Randelle's methods. Young people became more cautious about accepting rides from strangers after Worrell's crimes came to light. Religious communities grappled with how faith could be twisted into justification for murder after Hanae's arrests. These killers didn't just take lives, they stole innocence and trust from entire populations. The role of accomplices and enablers in these cases reveals another disturbing dimension of human nature. Whether through active participation, willful ignorance, or societal indifference, these killers rarely operated in complete isolation. Some had partners who helped dispose of bodies or provided alibis. Others benefited from communities that turned a blind eye to suspicious activities or dismissed concerns about missing persons from marginalized populations. The complicity of others, whether conscious or unconscious, allowed these killing sprees to continue far longer than they should have. Perhaps most chilling is how these killers were often described by those who knew them as quiet, helpful, even charming individuals. This disconnect between public persona and private reality demonstrates the sophisticated deception capabilities of serial killers. They understood intuitively how to blend into society, how to present themselves as trustworthy and normal while harboring the darkest of intentions. This ability to compartmentalize their lives allowed them to maintain relationships, hold jobs, and participate in community activities while simultaneously planning and executing murders. The geographic spread of these crimes, from the remote Australian outback to the bustling streets of Moscow, from the holy city of Mashhad to the recovering nation of Yemen, proves that the phenomenon of serial killing is not confined to any particular culture, economic system, or historical period. Evil, it seems, is a universal human potential that can manifest anywhere, anytime, under the right conditions. This universality should humble us and remind us that vigilance against such darkness is a constant human responsibility. The methods employed by these killers reveal a disturbing creativity in inflicting suffering. From Randelle's slow poisoning with acid to Haneyeh's strangulation with religious coverings, from Komarov's hammer blows to Al-Hubal's firearms, each killer developed their own signature approach to murder. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated acts of violence that often involved prolonged suffering for the victims. The premeditation evident in their methods makes their crimes all the more horrifying. The investigation of these cases also highlights the importance of believing victims and taking missing person reports seriously. In several instances, early warning signs were dismissed or overlooked, allowing the killers to continue their sprees. Family members who reported concerns were sometimes ignored. Witnesses who came forward weren't always believed, and patterns that should have been recognized were missed. These failures remind us that effective crime prevention requires not just good investigative techniques, but also a willingness to listen and respond to community concerns. The psychological aftermath for survivors, both those who escaped these killers and the family members of victims, represents another layer of tragedy that extends far beyond the immediate crimes. The trauma of knowing how close they came to death, or of losing loved ones in such brutal circumstances, created ripple effects that lasted for generations. Children who witnessed these events, family members who discovered bodies, and communities that lived in fear all carried psychological scars that time could never fully heal. The media coverage of these cases varied dramatically depending on the time period and location, but in each instance, the revelation of the crimes shocked the public and challenged existing assumptions about safety and security. The more sensational cases generated extensive coverage that sometimes hindered investigations, while others received relatively little attention, allowing the killers to operate with less scrutiny. This uneven attention highlights how media focus can both help and hinder law enforcement efforts. The legal proceedings in these cases revealed the challenges of prosecuting serial killers, particularly in eras or locations where forensic science was less advanced. Establishing chains of evidence, proving connections between crimes, and demonstrating intent required innovative approaches from prosecutors. The death penalty was applied in several cases, reflecting society's ultimate condemnation of these crimes, though the effectiveness of capital punishment as a deterrent remains debated. The international nature of some of these cases, with killers crossing borders or operating in regions with limited law enforcement cooperation, foreshadowed the modern challenges of investigating crimes in an interconnected world. Even decades ago, these cases demonstrated how criminals could exploit jurisdictional boundaries and communication gaps between law enforcement agencies to evade capture. The preservation of evidence and case files from these investigations has proven invaluable for modern criminal profilers and researchers studying serial killer behavior. The detailed records, when they exist, provide insights into the evolution of criminal investigation techniques and the consistent patterns that emerge in serial killer behavior across different cultures and time periods. These historical cases serve as a foundation for understanding contemporary criminal behavior. The impact on law enforcement officers who worked these cases cannot be understated. Many investigators carried the psychological burden of these crimes for the rest of their careers, haunted by the victims they couldn't save and the images they couldn't forget. The development of psychological support services for law enforcement personnel working violent crimes can be traced in part to the recognition of trauma experienced by officers investigating cases like these. As we conclude this examination of these 5 lesser-known but equally horrifying serial killers, we must remember that their stories serve as more than just cautionary tales. They are reminders of our collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable, to remain vigilant against the signs of predatory behavior, and to ensure that the voices of victims are never silenced or ignored. The darkness that these killers represented still exists in our world today, perhaps in forms we haven't yet recognized or in places we haven't yet looked. Their legacy should not be fear, but rather a renewed commitment to justice, compassion, and the protection of human life. These 5 killers represent the darkest corners of human nature, each leaving a trail of devastation that shocked their communities and challenged our understanding of evil itself. From Martha Randelle's calculated torture of innocent children to Saeed Hanai's twisted religious justifications, these cases remind us that monsters can hide behind ordinary faces in any society. The methodical brutality of Vasily Komarov and the limited but chilling details of Abdullah Al-Hubal's crimes demonstrate that serial killers have plagued humanity across different cultures and time periods. While Christopher Worrell's story differs from the others as a domestic terrorist rather than a serial killer, his case still illustrates how extremist ideologies can drive individuals to commit heinous acts against innocent people. These forgotten names serve as sobering reminders that evil often lurks in the shadows of history, and by understanding these cases, we honor the memory of their victims while remaining vigilant against such darkness in our own time.